Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. There has been a lot of discussion about a newly discovered Infinity Clan Boss team composition featuring Vault Keeper Wixwell here. Now, I haven't discussed Infinity teams too often in the past on my channel because up until this point, they haven't been very accessible. Infinity teams of the past have required very specific legendary champions and god tier gear. However, Vault Keeper Wixwell is changing all of that. Not only is he relatively accessible as the most recent fusion champion, but the compositions that he empowers are much more budget friendly, much more free to play friendly than any Infinity teams of the past. And as a result, it is my suspicion that a bunch of you are either currently contemplating or even attempting to build your very first Infinity team. So in today's video, what I'd like to do is discuss Infinity teams. What are they? How do they work? What are the advantages and disadvantages? We'll even discuss some factors you have to consider when speed tuning to make sure your team doesn't fall out of sync. So if you are interested in understanding a little bit more about Infinity teams, this is the video that you want to watch. I hope you're ready for it. Let's get started. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of you out there for all of your support and encouraging words to me and my family over the past few months. If you don't know, my wife and I had our first baby, a baby boy, just about 5 weeks ago. He is happy and healthy and safe here at home with us. It has been a time of joy and very little sleep for us, but we are adjusting. We're doing well. And so I do appreciate sincerely all of the messages, the encouragement, the celebrations from all of you. It's been absolutely fantastic. And don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and consider joining our Discord community. I think it's one of the best Discord communities in all of Raid Shadow Legends, and I hope you come check it out. Okay, once again, thank you so much. Now let's get back to the video. Okay, so whenever we do a Clan Boss speed tune video, we come here to deadwoodjedi.com because we want to use his Clan Boss calculator. I will put the link to this website in the description of my video. If you are reluctant to use the Clan Boss calculator, or you have never used the Clan Boss calculator before, I highly recommend you use this opportunity to get over that reluctance, because this speed tune, this Wixwell Infinity Clan Boss speed tune, is quite possibly the most accessible, most friendly, most gear-friendly one-key Ultra Nightmare team that's ever been created in Raid Shadow Legends. So if you have Wixwell, you're going to want to understand how to do this comp, and that's going to require you to at least accept the Clan Boss calculator as a necessary evil in the short term. I actually think it's an incredible tool, and I have a lot of videos that give tutorials about how to use it, so you can go and check my YouTube channel or just search Clan Boss and you'll find videos regarding the Clan Boss calculator, and hopefully that will get you up to speed. Now, if you're a Clan Boss veteran and you've used the calculator a whole bunch, then this should be easy peasy for you. We just have to talk about a few of the differences between an Infinity team and the other kinds of teams. So let's go ahead and start with one of the other common teams that a lot of players like to build, and that is the Myth Air comp. So this is one of the most accessible, unkillable compositions in the game. It's not a guaranteed one key Ultra Nightmare result. I would say it's probably comfortably a 2-key. You may even start at a 3-key and have to work your way up. But this is a very comfortable 2-key for most players if you can get the speed tune to work. You can see the speeds are not overly demanding. It only takes 3 epics and a rare plus any DPS that you like. Yes, Demitha is a void epic, so she's a little bit tricky to get, and some players will play for years and never get her. One of the reasons why the Wixwell composition is so appealing, because he was a fusion, which meant that a lot of people could guarantee themselves that champion. So hopefully you've gotten him. Otherwise, I don't know why you're still watching the video, but hopefully you have him. And that means you don't have to wait to pull another champion, because all the other champions that you need are free. He's literally the only champion that you need to make this work that you have to acquire who's a legendary or anything like that. You can do this with all rares. Not that we're going to necessarily, but you can. So anyway, let's get back to this composition. We just want to talk about how this composition works a little bit. So if we pull up this calculator, this is the Myth Air composition. And as you can see, it comes into tune relatively quickly on turn 2. And the way this calculator works is if you've never seen it before, is the clan boss has 3 turns, and so we have 3 columns. Column 1 is all of our turns, and then the clan boss takes his AoE 1. Second column is all of our turns, the clan boss goes his AoE 2. Third column is all of our turns, clan boss goes stun, and then it cycles back to the beginning. Most speed tunes have all the turns look identical. Some are not identical, like the turns may be different, but this one, all the turns look identical. The way this works is Demytha places her block damage buff at the end of each column and protects everybody from all damage. Now, if you don't know how to read this, basically all of the colors are color-coded to the champions. So when you see a blue bar, that's Demytha going. When you see a purple bar, that's Eris going. Okay? This is the turn order. The buffs, like all the icons that you see, if it's a green buff, it is being applied on that champion's turn. If it is a solid blue buff, it is a buff that has already been applied and is currently up and not falling off. If it is a faded blue buff, then it is coming off on that turn. So here, Demytha is losing her speed buff. She is got an increased attack buff that was applied previously and is staying up, and then she is literally applying the block damage buff right there. So that's how to read the buff. And then the skills that apply the buffs are the, A1, A2, A3 at the right hand of the column. Okay, so that's basically how to read the calculator readout. And you're going to want to get familiar with that. You're going to want to mess around with that a little bit just to make sure that you feel comfortable understanding exactly what's happening. But okay, so this is an unkillable speed tune. Demytha makes everybody unkillable at the end of every column, and that guarantees you 50 turns to go ahead and do your damage. Now, the nice thing about an unkillable team is you get that guaranteed 50 turns, and it only takes 1 buff to make your team unkillable, either a block damage buff or an unkillable buff, allowing all of your other champions to bring other buffs and debuffs into the team. Now, that's different from a killable team, right? A killable team actually works in a similar way in that you want to place specific buffs at specific times in order to extend the life of your team. But instead of just 1 buff, you might need an ally protect, a strengthen, an increased defense, a shield, maybe a veil. Maybe you need a damage mitigation, like on a passive from someone like, Corvus or Geomancer or Duchess, somebody who has just damage mitigation in their kit as well. But the idea there is to take as little damage as possible and, again, extend the life of the team. The disadvantage is you got to bring a lot of defensive buffs and you may not last 50 turns. The advantage is once you have really good gear and the right champions and the right speed tune, you can go past 50 turns. So you have more turns to do the damage you need to get a 1-key Ultra Nightmare. Now, technically, an Infinity Comp is a traditional killable team, so it's built the same way. You're trying to get super defensive and live as long as possible. So when we talk about an Infinity Comp, it's not really different than a killable comp in concept. However, the way you're getting that survivability does change. So on a killable composition, what would happen, or same thing here with the unkillable team, is the buffs drop off. You can see all the faded buffs. Demytha applies her block damage, and then it falls off the next turn. And then she applies it again, and it falls off the next turn, and she applies it again. With an Infinity Comp, the buffs have infinite duration. They get applied once, they never drop off, and they never have to be reapplied. That's where the infinity word comes from. Now, you may think to yourself, well, it's also an infinity team because it runs an infinite length. Well, sort of. Okay, so like there are a lot of associations with the word infinity, but the concept is the buffs have infinite duration. That's what makes it an infinity team. So an infinity composition could die on turn 20. If it's a poorly constructed infinity comp, it will have infinite buffs, but they won't keep the team alive because you don't have the stats or the gear or the right combination of champions. So let's go ahead and look at a theoretical version of an infinity comp. Here I have created an infinity comp that has a 1-to-1 speed tune, right? So every one of our champions is going once, and then the clan boss goes once. And that's it. So what we have here is Vaultkeeper Wixwell is going to open with his A3. Now his A3 skill applies his shield and his increased defense. Okay, now that's really important. So we're getting increased defense and shield on everybody. that should only ever be applied once. From this point on, we're going to have 3 buff extenders extend that buff infinitely. So if you think about it, everybody is taking 3 turns per cycle. So if we increase the duration of the buff 3 times, it will never drop off, right? They'll take a turn and then get an increase duration. Take a turn, increase duration. Take a turn, increase duration. So, it loses a duration, gains a duration, loses a duration, gains a duration. And so as a result, the buffs will never come off. So Vaultkeeper Wixwell places his A3. Now, Corvus has a buff extension on his A2. We are actually going to make that the priority skill. You'd have to change this in the AI because we want him to fire it every 3 turns. We don't want his A3 to interrupt his A2. So we've made the priority the A2. So you can see Vaultkeeper Wixwell goes here, and then Corvus the Corruptor extends that buff right there. Now, Godseeker Aniri is another buff extension champion, and she extends the buff again. So we have now had 2 buff extensions. Now, on the next turn, on turn 1, Vaultkeeper Wixwell comes around to his A2, which is also his buff extension. And now he extends it again. So it's been extended 3 times, and that will happen over and over and over again. Now, the way that we have treated the A3, we've turned it off by basically saying it has a 60-turn cooldown. This is just to simulate it in the calculator. In the actual game, in the AI, what you're going to do is you're going to open with the A3 and then shut it off. And then it's just off. It doesn't need to be on. The advantage of this is that your champions don't have to fire all of their defensive skills over and over and over again. They can just use their attacks. So the only skills that are going to be used are attacks and buff duration extensions. That's it. That's literally it. So that means that you can turn it while Godseeker Aniri's, A3 is her revive. You don't need that. And then you have these damage dealers. Now, let's talk about Wixwell for a second. His A2 is also his shield growth mechanic. Now, this is how we are going to increase our survivability. So we have the increased defense. That means we're going to take less damage. But we also have this shield, right? And the A2 not only extends the duration of the shield, but it grows the shield. The way that Wixwell's shield growth works, it's different than Brogni's. His is based on the number of buffs the skill extends. So the more buffs you have, the more buffs that get extended, the bigger the shield growth becomes. So it's not based on his damage. It's literally just based on the buffs that he extends. So there are 3 ways to increase the effectiveness of this shield growth. The first is to get him more turns. The more times he goes, the more he fires his A2, the more times he increases the size of the shield. The second thing is increase the number of buffs you're bringing on your team, because when the A2 goes off, if it has more buffs to extend, the shield growth is bigger. And then the third way that you can increase it is by using like refresh accessories, refresh masteries, or even a reflex set so that he gets back around to his A2 even faster. You could even use a cooldown reduction champion if you wanted to make sure that that fired more frequently. That's a little bit overkill. I don't think that's necessary, but you could do that. So by firing off his A2 more frequently, he keeps growing the shields more often. So those 3 ways are going to improve the shield growth. At some point, what you want to do is you want the shield growth to exceed the amount of damage that you're taking and continue to get the shield bigger and bigger and bigger. You do that enough, and you're going to go all the way to the turn limit, 1,500 turns. And that should be enough with almost any slate of champions, any team composition, to do 1 key Ultra Nightmare damage. Okay, so that's basically the concept here. So when you are bringing in your DPS, by the way, I know some of these teams like use speed boosters, like you could use Apothecary or you could use High Katoon. High Katoon has a buff. Apothecary has a buff. That's an increased speed buff. That's there. You might not want to use Godseeker Aniri. You could use a different champion that also brings a buff. So for instance, let's say you used Hellborn Sprite. So Hellborn Sprite actually has, I think it's an increased crit rate buff. And so you got another buff there. So if you have a buff extender that brings buffs themselves, then once those buffs go up, you can extend those and you can grow the shield even more when Wixwell uses his buff extension. I hope that makes sense, right? The more buffs you bring, the more multipliers Wixwell gets on his shield growth. Okay, so this is why this is such a great team, because you could use, let's say, Valerie here. Valerie is another rare who has buff extension. Now, when we talk about the buff extension, there are a couple of things that matter. One is that the buff extension has to always be prioritized, and it has to be on a 3-turn cooldown. Okay, it can't be on a 4-turn cooldown. If you have it on a 4-turn cooldown, you have to bring in a 4th buff extender. Okay, so you want it on a 3-turn cooldown. The other thing that you have to worry about is that your buff extenders must all be going at the same speed. Not the same like speed, but they must be going at the same speed ratio. So if they're all going at a 1-to-1, that's fine. If they're all going at a 2-to-1, that's fine. If they're all going at a 4-to-3, that's fine. But they need to all go the exact same number of times throughout the entire fight. Okay? Past turn 1. Turn 1, you can split them up a little bit, but once you get past turn 0, everybody needs to go the same number of turns. Okay, that's really important. Now, your DPS don't. Your DPS can go slower, or they can go the same number. Okay, so if everybody's going 2-to-1, that's awesome. But let's say your buff extenders are all going at 2-to-1, and your DPS are all going at 1-to-1. That would also be fine. That would totally be fine, because that doesn't break the speed tune. That just means you're going to do less damage. But you're going to get 1,500 turns. You're going to do enough damage. So think about it this way. If anybody outruns a buff, because it never gets reapplied, it's gone forever. So nobody's allowed to go faster than anybody else because they would outrun a buff. So no relentless sets, no extra turn mechanics are allowed. You can't run with an extra turn mechanic. So no Deacon Armstrong, no Seeker, you know, no DPS that get extra turns, none of that. Now, the one nice thing is if you have Cycle of Magic on a buff extender in your masteries, so that is in the support tree, Cycle of Magic gives you a 5% chance of a cooldown reduction. That is totally fine in an Infinity comp on your buff extender. It's actually totally fine on everybody. There's no way that a cooldown reduction on a skill that you turn off could mess you up, right? Like, think about it this way. I'm turning off Wixwell's A3. He's only going to use it once. So the only skill that could possibly have its cooldown reduced is the buff extension. And if you get more buff extensions, then the buffs never wear out. Right? So it's okay to have the cooldown reduction. So that's one thing that's different than like an unkillable or a killable team. You don't want Cycle of Magic on one of those champions, right? You can't have any turn meter increase. You don't want to use any of those masteries. You still have to avoid all of those. But you can use the Cycle of Magic. You can use Reflex. You can use Refresh Accessory. Okay, so that's the basics of the theory here. Now, obviously, this speed tune probably wouldn't work. The reason this wouldn't work is because Wixwell is not growing the shield fast enough. By only taking one turn, right, he's only growing it once per cycle. If I can get this team to a 2-to-1 ratio, then he's growing it twice per clan boss cycle. And that's just going to be better. In addition, this team doesn't have enough buffs. Just doesn't have enough buffs. We're going to want more buffs. So one thing to remember is you do want that second shield. You want to bring in a shield set with somebody. That's going to give you a second shield. That's going to increase your survivability and allow your shields to grow. You can also grow both shields. So if you have an artifact shield and you have Wixwell's skill shield, you're allowed to have both. That's going to give you your best opportunity. So you got to figure out who you want to pull or put a shield set on, rather. And again, any of your DPS hopefully are bringing additional buffs. Really good additional buffs to bring are increased crit damage, increased attack if you're using attack-based champions. You could bring a strengthen, like there's no reason not to bring a strengthen. So for instance, you want to use Morag, right? Morag Bronzelock would be a great DPS champion because she's giving you ally attack plus she's giving you strengthen. That strengthen buff will be extended forever, or it can get reapplied. It's okay to reapply buffs as long as you're not messing with the shield. As long as the shield doesn't get wiped out and reapplied, you're fine. But you don't have to reapply buffs, right? That's the nice thing about the Infinity comp. Okay, now let's talk about things that can mess this comp up. Now, other than the shield breaking, which just decreases your survivability, what actually breaks the speed comp? We already know that Cycle of Magic doesn't break the speed comp, which is great. Turn meter changes would, right? So a turn meter increase would. But what else can happen? Well, in this particular case, we know that Wixwell has sort of a block debuff buff, right? He has his new mechanic, which is, what's it called again? It's called Intercept, right? But Intercept only goes up on one ally. And he's not going to be reusing this skill. So realistically, like, Intercept isn't going to act like a block debuffs buff. Okay. So what you want to do instead is you want to either have somebody who cleanses the debuffs, or you want someone who has a block debuffs buff that can then be extended. Because if any of the buff extenders are stunned, the game is over. Now, if you want to go with a stun target scenario, you can. There's actually a way to do it without a cleanse and without a block debuffs. But the block debuffs is probably the easiest because it's another buff. You want to bring a buff anyway, and you just want to extend that for a really long time. So let's bring in somebody like, you know who's actually really good? This is going to be really cheap. But we can go ahead and bring in Spirit Host. Now, Spirit Host has two buffs. Spirit Host will actually give you an increase attack and then also give you a block debuffs buff. But both of these can be turned onto a 60 turn because you don't need either skill. And you're just going to use your A1. So you can see it gets applied here in column 1. That A3 goes up. Everybody has a block debuffs buff. And then that block debuffs buff should be extended indefinitely. Except it needs to go up at the right moment, or it needs to go up in the right order. So at this moment, Spirit Host actually shouldn't be in the yellow block. That's important because you can see what happens is it does fall, that block debuff falls off of this second water boy here, right? Or water boy, second war boy. So what we need is we need to mix this. We could put Spirit Host. We could put Spirit Host as the second fastest champion. That would work fine. We could put Spirit Host here. I think I had Hellborn Sprite's skills messed up. That must have been what it was. Yeah, okay. So it's the A3. It's Hellborn Sprite's A3 that extends the buff. So Hellborn Sprite extends it, then Valerie extends it, and you can see Vaultkeeper Wixwell extends it on the next turn. And now we have a block debuff buff up for all time. This is nice because it solves not only the stun, it also solves Spirit Affinity. So if you have somebody who has a block debuff buff, you know, in this case, we get 2 buffs, right? We get 2 nice buffs. So that not only increases the multiplication of the shields by Vaultkeeper Wixwell, but it prevents the stun forever. This buff never falls off. Okay, so that prevents one of the things that can mess up this speed tune. However, let's say you wanted to go with a team that doesn't use a block debuffs buff. Now we've got something a little bit trickier. We could put Vaultkeeper here, and we could use a Doom Priest. And we could have her cleanse at the top of every turn with her passive. That would solve the problem. Again, you know, trying to get to a 2-to-1 ratio, you still need Doom Priest at the top of the turn order to cleanse every time. She'll cleanse the stun, she'll cleanse the slow, and this will make you full affinity friendly. She also gives you an increased attack buff. So not as many buffs as Spirit Host, but still a very good champion, so you could use her here instead. Now, finally, you can say, okay, I don't want to use Cleanse Champion. I don't want to use Doom Priest. I don't want to use Spirit Host because I think she's a trash champion or something. And I would rather just absorb the stun. So the really important thing is that your 3 buff extenders cannot take the stun. So what you need is you need 2 buff extenders of the same affinity. And then you need a DPS of each affinity that you're using. So Vaultkeeper Wixwell is Force Affinity. So if your other 2 buff extenders share an affinity, right? So if they're both magic. So let's say we used, or they're, I guess they could be void. You know, you could use Godseeker and Eerie. You could use two of the same champion. You could, let's say we used Hellborn and we used Hellborn. Right? So if we did this, we know that the two Hellborns are the same affinity. And I believe Hellborn Sprite is magic affinity. Is that what she is? No, she's spirit affinity. Okay. So Hellborn Sprite is spirit affinity. And so what that means is Vaultkeeper Wixwell is force affinity, and we have two spirit affinities. So what we need to do is put them in the turn order. Towards the bottom of the turn order. Okay. And in the front, like in the team order, not the turn order, it doesn't matter, but the team order matters. So you can make the speeds whatever you want. But at the top, we're going to put in a force affinity champion. Let's say we put in Razin Scarred High. And then we're going to put in a spirit affinity champion. Let's say we put in Newt. And what happens now is Razin will take the stun when Vaultkeeper Wixwell is weak affinity. When force is weak affinity, so into spirit affinity, Razin should take the stun. And into magic affinity, Newt should take the stun. And then when everybody is neutral affinity, it should still go in turn order, and Razin should take the stun. So the reason to do this would be so that your buff extenders never take the stun, because you can't miss a buff extension. You are not allowed to miss a buff extension. But your DPS can take stuns. That's fine. That just means they don't hit. That just means they don't hit. So this would be the way to go 3 affinity friendly, right? Like Spirit's still going to mess you up, but this would work for Magic, Void, and Force. I guess Spirit, you know, I was thinking for Spirit affinity, Razin would take the stun, but honestly, unless you get the speed tune in such a way that the slow doesn't matter, which you could do, then this wouldn't work. Like if the slow throws you off, then the slow is going to throw you off. But the nice thing about an infinity comp is that if the slow applies to everybody, it shouldn't change the number of turns that everybody takes. So let's go ahead and do this. If we do this, yeah, it might. Because it looks like Wixwell misses a turn here. But we could figure this out, right? We could figure this out and actually make it work just fine, because 4 champions, like one champion is losing a turn, but if it's a DPS who loses a turn, that's fine. So we could make Wixwell, you know, the 209 champion here, and make Razin the 198. And now Razin loses the turn. So Hellborn Sprites all go, Wixwell all goes, and then it's fine. Because as long as your buff extenders all go the same number of turns, and everybody else goes the same number of turns or less, then you're fine. So this would work even through Spirit Affinity. And again, Razin would take the stun. So that's it, basically. Think about building this team at a 2-to-1 ratio. Think about building this team with as many buffs as you can get onto the team. Think about how you're going to handle the slow and the stun in order to go fully affinity friendly. I highly recommend bringing a block debuffs champion that is just easier than anything else. And then it literally doesn't matter who gets hit with the stun, and then you don't care about affinities. And that's going to allow you to bring, you know, other DPS that you might want to bring in. If you have any questions about how an infinity comp works, please put those in the comments below and I will try to get to them. Also, remember that you can always come to my Discord community and ask questions in the various channels there. And you can go at ColeRed in any post that you put, and I'll see it and maybe respond to your question. I think this is a really cool speed tune. I will be following up this video where I'm actually going to build one of these infinity comps. I have built one before. I really wanted to build one before, and I couldn't quite get it to go a ton of turns. Like it worked, the speed tune worked, but it didn't go forever. And I want this one to go forever. So I'm going to be working on it over the next few days, and you should watch out for that video coming soon. All right, that has been it for me. Thanks so much for hanging out. I've been ColeRed, and I will see you in another video soon.